We want to be a reliable source of talent for the business. And the only way to do that is by being proactive. And the only way to be proactive is by leveraging as much data as we can. TA's done a great job of educating the business about how tough it is to fill jobs, but we haven't done a great job of educating the business around it's tough to fill jobs and here's what you need to do differently. And I think the business is really craving that level of leadership from talent acquisition, sourcing, whatever the department is, whatever name it is, to lead them through these challenges.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Hiring Excellence. I'm Johnny Campbell, CEO of Social Talent and your host for today's podcast. So today on the pod, we're going to be talking about strategic workforce planning, but bear with me. Not in that sense, because sometimes people yawn and go, well, that's an unsolvable thing. But really what we're talking about is proactive recruiting versus reactive recruiting. And our guest today has been working on this problem for quite some time and is making success. I think it's an important story to hear for any of you leaders in TA who've always wanted to be more proactive. We've got one person's or one team's journey and what we can learn from them. And it's never a finished journey. And our guest today is going to be sharing, there's still more to do. I think it's a real insight in terms of how TA firms can, or TA teams can become much more proactive. So joining me today, we've got Mike Peterson. So Mike is the Senior Director of Talent Sourcing, Intelligence and Innovation with Edwards Lifesciences. Mike, it's really great to have you on the show. You're joining us from San Diego this morning, I think, are you?
Yeah, I'm here in San Diego. It's a pleasure to be on the show, and it's grateful for the opportunity.
Well, Mike, I'm joining from San Jose, so just up the coast from me this morning on the same time zone, which makes a change for this kind of podcast recording. Well, Mike, tell us about, before we get into Edwards Lifesciences, tell us about your career. Where did it all start? What got you into recruiting, some of the companies you worked with, and then we can dig into a little bit more about Edwards.
Yeah, of course. So, when I first got out of college or high school, I wanted to be a pilot. So hence the little device behind me that shows my aviation geekness. But I ended up deciding that wasn't for me and my family. So of course I pivoted to recruiting because that's the natural backup plan for all pilots. And I got a job at Manpower working as a recruiter. And that's where I really learned how to work with clients, assess candidates and all that. Ended up working for a client in the defense sector, a company called SAIC, worked on some fascinating work, interviewed shuttle commanders, heads of information security for parliaments and the UN and all kinds of other great organizations. And then throughout my career, I've just pivoted closer and closer to one of my core missions. So after SAIC, I worked for the largest healthcare system here in San Diego called Sharp Healthcare. Really fell in love with the healthcare mission, and then decided I needed to learn international recruiting. So I worked for GIA, not CIA, G as in golf. Learned how to work internationally. Ended up working at another company called Viasat in satellite and space business. When things were not going as well there, I ended up coming here to Edwards Lifesciences, which has been a great marriage of this geeky side of the engineering that I love so much and the healthcare mission. So they're both kind of melded together here very well for me.
And you're doing just over 8 years at Edwards. So tell us about the products. How might the average person interact with Edwards Lifesciences products or businesses?
Yeah. So, truth be told, it's better for someone to not have to interact with our products because we make medical devices, specifically our flagship products, are heart valves. So we focus on structural heart disease. If someone has an issue with their heart valve, there are several different options that we produce to help them improve their lives. So whether that's a transcatheter heart valve where inside of a afternoon, someone can have just a small incision on the inside of their thigh and come out with a new heart valve and start resuming a normal life for them, to more surgical options that obviously require more recovery time. The challenge that we have is the main condition that we treat, which is called aortic stenosis, is very underdiagnosed throughout the world. It's unfortunately attributed to being older and just shortness of breath and not able to do the same things. But It's an actual problem that can be solved and should be solved because eventually it catches up with you. We're also starting to push forward into heart failure management. So looking at how to improve the way physicians monitor that condition, which has always been very challenging. There's not really a good, simple way to monitor that condition and manage it effectively. So pleased to see that we're able to touch more patient lives as a result. And our core mission here is really just to improve the lives of patients around the world and the lives of their families.
Brilliant to be able to work for a mission-driven business that everyone can
Absolutely.
see does amazing value in the world. As you say, you
Yes.
don't want to have to come across it, but when you do, it literally can be a lifesaver. But tell us, Mike, about the size of the organization. You mentioned getting experience internationally, so maybe you might talk about the operations where you hire around the world, or your team hires, maybe some of the hiring volumes, and maybe some of the roles that you hire for, and how you structure the team, just to set the scene, if you don't mind.
Yeah, yeah. So, we're a global organization. We're about 16,000 employees now. We operate in every region of the world, 43 countries roughly. Our major operations are here in California, where our headquarters is. And then we have manufacturing operations in Singapore, Costa Rica, Utah, Spain, and always looking for new sites. We used to have sites in the Caribbean as well, but there's some changes and spinning off of a business that changed that. And then we have sizable operations on the clinical and commercial side in Germany, Japan, China is a market that we're expanding to, but we have presence, in many countries. The type of positions that we recruit for are everything from manufacturing employees. So every valve is sewn by hand, to biomedical engineers, field clinical specialists, sales people, marketing, all the business operations. And we probably hire anywhere between 3 to 5, maybe close to 6,000 people per year, depending on how fast we're growing in that particular year. So
Wow.
it's good volume.
And how is your team structured, Mike, in terms of how you set it up? Is it regionally organized by line of business, a combo? And has it always been that way?
Yeah, so I would say it's a little bit of a combo. So outside of the US, I have regional teams where we have a APAC team and a EMEA team that also supports Latin America. And then within the US, we're a little bit more oriented by business units or position types. And
Sure.
sometimes it's a little bit of a combination of both. Now that's within the sourcing team. The recruiting team, which is reporting to someone else, is organized in a similar way. So outside of the US, they're regional. Within the US, they're business unit and specialty specific.
And
And we
how do
probably
you
have
find that?
about
Yeah.
150 people, 160 people in talent acquisition total, but there's multiple practices within TA, not just sourcing and recruiting.
How do you like just divide sourcing and recruiting? What's the line? And then what would the other practices be?
So basically, the two ways that recruiting and sourcing separate themselves is sourcing will be focused on strategic talent pipelining based on our workforce plan and what we know of business needs. So if there's a regular cadence of need for whatever reason, we'll be focused on building pools and pipelines of talent ahead of time for the business, and we'll get into a little bit how the workforce plan informs that. Recruiting will kind of look more at incoming requisitions, manage the requisitions, hiring managers and HR teams, and then draw from our pools of talent that we've developed ahead of time. Or if they run into problems with the position, like, hey, we're just not getting the traction that we need, then they'll reach out and ask that my team be engaged. So we kind of step in ahead of need, and then as a backup to when things aren't going to plan.
Has that always been the case, Mike, or is that a kind of structure you developed over the years?
So the strategic talent pipeline portion, I would say, has evolved a little bit more since I came into the role about a year ago. Um, we had strategic talent pipelines that were defined kind of more anecdotally. And one of the things that I wanted to do was really tick and tie it into what we call big rock projects. So these are major initiatives from the HR team that may or may not show up on a workforce plan because they're multi-year endeavors, or onto the strategic workforce plan. And then I have the two pressure test each other. So just because something appears in one space doesn't mean
Mm.
I automatically have the team start building pools. I want to see some skin in the game, or some requisitions starting to at least appear on the workforce plan before we dedicate resources to that. In the past, I think the pipelines were a little bit more broad than they are now. So, and that's something that we're still getting into place, to be honest. As most
So,
companies, our workforce plan is far from perfect. So,
uh, I haven't found a company yet who thinks their workforce plan works well.
yeah,
But when we think about recruiting, most teams are reactive, right? What you would call the reactive recruiting, and they don't have any proactive recruiting really at all. Wait for a rec to open. They still might have a sourcing team that then go to market and try and proactively find talent. Um, and even more so lately when we see such volume of what you might call AI generated or synthetic applicants coming in and posing a problem. A lot of teams are choosing to go outbound again to be more laser focused. But but what prompted the organization to try and move from the very traditional reactive recruiting approach to this proactive, and what kind of coverage of hires does the proactive approach have? Like, is this 20% of hires, half the hires? How does that work?
yeah. So let me start with how it started. So when I first came into Edwards, I was asked to develop a data-driven TA strategy, and I was supporting our largest business unit, so I was in a different role. Um, and as I thought about being data driven, I think a lot of TAs go to, well, let's focus on time to fill, quality of hire, hiring manager satisfaction, maybe cost per hire, those sorts of things. And as I thought about it, those are really mostly rear view mirror metrics. They tell you where you were. And what I thought we needed was more like a GPS. So imagine you're driving a car, right? Some things tell you where you've been, some things tell you where you are now, and some things help you get to where you need to be. And that's what I thought we needed. And so out of that, I thought, well, we really need to be better about leveraging the workforce plan, even if it's not good. And we just need to own the reality of how long it takes for us to do certain things. So, for example, if it's, Christmas Eve and I'm ordering my wife's Christmas presents off Amazon, even if I have Prime, it's not Amazon's fault that the present doesn't get there tomorrow, right? That's my fault. So, what if we applied the same thing using time to fill as an operational metric and other information that we have through the intelligence function to say, here's how long we think it's going to take us to fill the role. You just need to tell us when you need it. And that's what comes from the workforce plan. So when the HR team said, hey, where's your data driven strategy? I said, oh, here it is. You're going to provide me this. That's what's going to drive us forward. And eventually they warmed up to the idea, is not what they expected. And then we had an opportunity through a pilot to prove the concept, which turned out to work really well. And since then, I brought it into sourcing as a way to define our pipelines as well.
So how does I think most people know how the traditional reactive approach starts, but can you walk us through an example of how you take a workforce plan or a bulk of a group of roles perhaps that are a plan, and then build back from that anticipated start date and start thinking about hiring, and how does that then compare to maybe a traditional hiring process? Because you did show me a visualization. We don't have it here to show our audience, and that really helped. Maybe you could describe that to our audience to understand the two, compare it side by side.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. The way that it works is we receive the workforce plan, which is always changing throughout the year. So, we receive the initial workforce plan and we look at when is the position needed. So we receive all the roles. The way our workforce plans tend to work is it shows all the headcount every month by, different types and departments and that sort of thing. And we look for those headcount changes. And if they go up, that's an add. So say someone needs a position or a headcount in November, then we take a look at our time to fill to see, okay, how long does it take for us to go from opening the rec to finding the person and getting an offer accept. Then we compare that to our intelligence that we have. how available is the talent locally? Do we have a high likelihood for relocation? How long does that take? And then, especially when you're working with managers between regions, you got to take into account the notice period, which some managers know, especially if they're
Mhm.
in region. But sometimes when you're working with a manager, stay in the U.S. and you're working on roles in Europe, they don't realize how long the notice period is. In fact, there are times that we get positions, they say, oh, I need it filled by this date. And I'm like, that's literally impossible because the notice period is longer than the time you've given us, which opens up a different conversation, and has in the past. So we take all of that data and we work backwards from, hey, you need it in November. We actually need to open this, say, in March to account for approval, sourcing, interview process, relocation notice period, whatever the case may be. And then we work towards that date. So our success metric when we're using the strategy is a little bit like a golf score. So the lower the number, the more successful we are. So it might be a 0, which means we got the person right on time, to a -7, so we got them a week early, to a +14, which is 14 days late. So that's how the calculation is run and is loaded into Workday, and that's how we measure our success when using this.
So what percentage of all the hires made in a given year, Mike, go through that process versus the reactive process, do you think?
Um, Right now, it's still the majority of positions. The strategy is
Uh,
slowly filtering out to the other TA teams. It's not used consistently, mainly because of workforce plan information availability. So some business units are really good about handing over their business plan or their workforce plans, and I would argue the ones that have seen the strategy work are more willing, and the other ones are a little bit more skeptical. Some of them don't feel the pain. To be honest, they have so few openings or so little volume that it's not causing a pain point. And this is where having the largest business unit with the largest volume of hires really helped.
Cool.
Is you know that, and they're very operationally focused. It was the operations global supply chain team that I used to support. So of course they love metrics, they love process, and that was another opportunity we used to measure or to leverage getting the strategy in.
So I love this. Rather than it being a time to fill type goal where you're getting it down from 90 days to 80 days, again, your point is more accuracy. Is it 0? Is it -7? Is it +7? So it's more, again, it's a forecast. It's about hitting the forecast versus actually just measuring some arbitrary number of days that goes down, which might be, divided by every other role, like no context to whether that was on time, late, or early.
Oh,
Much more aligned to the business, I imagine. So it does, as you mentioned a couple of times, require the workforce plan to be complete, to be accurate. Um, what's the process from, a workforce plan, let's call it on paper, to actually, kicking in the work in your team? Because that's got to drive a cost of the labor in your team and tools to try and drive candidate pipeline. Is there a filter or a process that kind of interrogates the plan to make sure it's still genuine, still correct, it's not missing information? What does that look like? Is it different for different departments?
yeah, yeah. So just this year, we started inputting the workforce plan into Workday. So every month I get a report of, what the most updated workforce plan is. Of course, there's always changes. And then we compare that to the information we had prior, whether it's the prior workforce plan or what we've heard from the business. Because, as you shift the business from being reactive to proactive, they start informing you about different things and giving you a heads up. Now, sometimes the heads up is accurate, and sometimes it gets scaled back or watered down a ton by the time it actually comes to fruition. So that's where we do the pressure testing. Like, okay, business, you said there were 10 openings coming. I'm not seeing that on the workforce plan. Let's not invest resources in that right now, especially given, if it's well out in the future. And then let's have a dialogue about, all right, you said there are 10. I'm not seeing the 10. Has something changed? Because as the business is running their operations, their first thought isn't, hey, let me call TA and tell them that we've had a change. And that's totally understandable. We want them focused on serving patients. But it gives us an opportunity to catch those changes or catch things that aren't working out as we expected, and at least, confirm with them and not just hope that they tell us.
And Mike, when you kind of look at that engagement process, who's doing that? Like, is that you, your leaders, or all the sources of power to deal directly with the business? So they go through the talent advisor? Like, how is that interacting? Like that kind of on the ground, having those conversations, doing that interrogation. Who's doing that work?
Yeah. So it's a little bit of everyone, right? It's the recruiting leader that's responsible for that region or that business unit that's taking a look at that. It's me and my leadership team in sourcing, looking at the workforce plans as well, trying to understand what's changing in the business. And to be honest, I'm kind of the carrier of the information out from Workday, since I run the reports monthly, and I share them or talk to the leaders as needed. And then we go forward to talk to the business leaders if there's something that's interesting enough to pursue. If we see something that's supposed to be 1 month and it doesn't show up, that's not that big a deal. But if we're not seeing it appear after a couple months, then it's like, well, okay, what's going on? Has that moved back to the following year, or is it canceled entirely? And then we can, you know, allocate resources that were kind of set aside for that work to other things. The sourcing team is extremely small here, so we got to be really diligent about how we focus them.
Do you measure things like a cancellation rate, like the amount of recs you start working on the end of cancel because the workforce plan shifted or changed or wasn't correct?
Um, we measure whether or not what percentage of requisitions are canceled. They're usually canceled. Like that's not necessarily going to show up on the workforce plan. Because by the time they're opened, then we assume that's good to go. We're working on it, but we do want to monitor if there's waste in the system, so to speak. And if we see a lot of requisitions being canceled, then we need to dive deeper into it. Well, what's going on? Because that's just consuming a lot of resources that could be used otherwise. One of the things that we benefit from here that other companies don't is we also charge for our requisitions. So if the business is on the fence about a requisition, they tend not to send it in. So it naturally pressure tests whether or not they have an actual need.
Speed or accuracy to start date isn't the only thing you solve for. But to tell us about the Valencia example in Spain, um,
Yeah.
some of the outcomes of that.
Yeah, so there is a couple interesting things. Valencia was our first larger scale, I call clean deployment of the strategy. So it was a brand new plant. We're starting from scratch, and since there's a lot of focus on a strategic initiative, the workforce plan was a little bit more baked than normal. So we compared to highlight the performance of the strategy. We compared the Valencia plant recruiting activity and on-time talent delivery metrics to the Spanish commercial or the other business entities within Spain. So they are in the same city. This is even comparing, one region to another. So Valencia plant was able to deliver talent 13 days early. So in other words, we're almost 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Whereas at the same period of time, the commercial organization was delivering plus 44 days. So a month and a half past business need. Now, that's nothing about the TA team. That's all about when recruiting is aware of the opening and pulls the trigger on action. Um, I'm I'm 99% confident because of the other example I have. That time to fill is the same. It's just we own the time to fill, and we were driving the opening of requisitions. The TA manager that I put in charge of the strategy at the time for Valencia, she was constantly reaching out to hiring managers, reaching out to HR saying, hey, here's this opening. You got to pull the trigger on it now if you want us to deliver by this date. And then that would start conversation. Oh, we're pulling that back. We're pulling that up. And there's a couple times that we caught things that we wouldn't have caught otherwise, where headcount was being moved from the plant to another location entirely without anyone knowing, or they were pushing a roll back and the business wasn't aware and didn't, the more senior leaders didn't agree with that. And so there's these ancillary benefits to having this much visibility on it that I think are really critical too.
these days, Mike, everyone's talking about moving to a more talent advisory model, a more consultative model. In
As
addition to the speed piece as well, have you found that it's driven those other benefits where, your team are actually consulting with the business, not just about when to fill the rec, but about what type of role, where to put it, maybe how to position it, what level to put it at. Does that kind of activity happen?
Yeah, it does. And to be fair, it's been happening a little bit more and more even without the strategy. Because one of the things that I encourage my teams to do is talk to your hiring managers about looking at their team as a talent portfolio. So in other words, don't just backfill with the same level. Things have probably changed on your team. So maybe you don't need a senior level of person, or maybe you need a more senior level person, or maybe you need someone with a different perspective because your team's starting to develop groupthink, so to speak, and struggles with solving problems or innovating. So, we take this as an opportunity to really drive that conversation. And the beauty of this strategy is it gives time for that conversation to take place. Because if the business is reacting like, oh my God, I thought I would have this person by now. Like how many times in an intake have we heard, "Oh, I need the person yesterday," and the manager's serious, and I get it. They're not going to want to sit down and talk about their talent portfolio and what's needed on the team and what they're struggling with. But this allows that conversation to happen more genuinely, I would
Mm.
say.
Can this scale to every role, or what is your goal? What's optimal amount of coverage for a strategic recruiting approach? And is it
Yeah,
achievable?
yeah. I think I. It depends on your volume. It depends on the complexity of the organization and the buy-in from the business. But I personally would like to see an entire organization shift to this as much as possible. Um, Backfilling is really tough because sometimes that is unexpected. But even in that case, I would argue there are ways to try to anticipate turnover. Maybe you don't know who exactly would leave, but you could recognize a pattern or whatever. Like if you look on someone's LinkedIn profile and they change jobs every 3 years, and that's consistent, and you're at your 2 plus 6 months, I would probably put my money on that person's looking. So maybe we proactively plan for that if it's a critical role. Um, but at minimum, I would say the critical positions that are touching the customer or drive the ability for the company to fulfill whatever its mission is. Those are the positions that should absolutely be part of the strategy. Um, for us, it's manufacturing and some of the engineering and some of the leadership positions for sure.
Is this a more costly approach, or is it more cost effective? Or is that the wrong way of framing it? Is it more about business value from being on time or on forecast?
Yeah, I it's hard to say if it's more costly or not. I could make an argument either way. Like there's more time invested by the TA team in these conversations, but those are the conversations should be taking place. So there's a
Mm.
value in that, right? Um, there's probably cost savings in not having to go to search because we're not so compressed on the timeline. And there are times in other companies, especially where we went to search on day one. We're like, this is so critical. We've got to bring someone in as soon as possible. This is the best way to do it. Um, but I think the real driver of the strategy or the value to the company is this business continuity, this reliability of talent, because that was the mission that I tasked my prior team with. Is we want to be a reliable source of talent for the business, and the only way to do that is by being proactive, and the only way to be proactive is by leveraging as much data as we can.
On the data side, you have mentioned a couple of times, but how important is that insights team, and what does that look like in terms of the parallel to the business plan? The internal business plan for workforce is one piece, but you mentioned you layer on these talent insights. So what is that talent? I assume it's like a small laser focused team using different tools to analyze the market. Like how does that work?
Yeah, yeah. So it's actually the sourcing team predominantly that does the labor market intelligence as well, which works out because they work so hand in glove and it allows this seamless kind of transfer of information. So I would say the sourcing team spends a good quarter to third of its time just on labor market intelligence in some cases, driving not only expectations around positions, but where the positions should physically be located. They're analyzing, especially in Europe, this country versus that country versus the third country, and walking the business through these pros and cons. And then based on where we land with that intelligence, then that tells us, well, when should we expect someone to be able to start? How long do we need to account for? And then if we have the workforce plan information, we can, layer that in and come up with our trigger dates.
What advice would you give to a leader maybe listening to this podcast and thinking, I want to do this. I want to set up some sort of sourcing intelligence part of our team. I want to take some of our roles, be more proactive, do our best with our workforce plan, notwithstanding the fact that it might not be perfect. How would you advise to get started? Or are there any learnings you've had along the way to maybe shortcut that for folks?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I always go to where is the opportunity, and a lot of times it's not what leaders think it is. So another example is our digital transformation team. So I get a call that's just hair on fire. Like, oh my God, this is so bad. This is a critical department. We're having so many problems. And as I talked to them, I saw this as the opportunity to do our first pilot with this strategy. So sometimes you take the person that's screaming the most and run a
Sure.
pilot with them, because I hate to say it, but in a way they back themselves into a corner. So with this digital transformation team, we talked them through the strategy, and they're basically like, hey, whatever you need, like, we're willing to do it. We're so desperate. And we went from delivering talent 42 days late to 35 days early. Now, I would say they also swung the pendulum a little. Like, this is one of
Too
the things
far.
we tend to do here, too far. Like, they're telling us too early when they needed. That's the problem I'd rather manage, because that's easier to manage. But I remember this team meeting with the VP, and he said, I don't understand what the problem is. I'm submitting my requisition 60 days ahead of time. And I said, how long does it take for approvals? And he said, well, yeah, they take about 45 days right now. So you've given us 2 weeks to find the talent. So, and I think where they swung the pendulum too far is I said, just send everything in now, no matter when it's due. And they kind of did that. But on the backside of that, they were so happy with the turnout, with the results. And that time to fill did not change. That is one that I checked. It stayed steady the entire time, pre-strategy, post-strategy. It's just another example of we owned the reality of what it was take. And the time to fill was 54 days. It was far from terrible for data scientist roles and digital engineering roles. But the business wasn't happy because they were still getting talent too late for their operation to continue.
What about getting buy-in from different business leaders and getting support for this? Was that difficult, or is there a magic trick you have or a piece of advice you suggest around getting buy-in from other leaders?
Yeah. So I think there's several different personas that you can look at in your business leaders to see who is this going to resonate with, who's going to latch on to this strategy a little bit easier. So in that prior example, we had a good combination of people that were in a bad spot. Granted, they backed themselves into that corner, but they were also very data oriented. So when we
True.
started talking about leveraging data, of course, they're like, oh, well, that makes sense. Um, so, that brings you to the second persona, which are people that are kind of process oriented, data driven. Again, this will resonate with them. So think of, maybe software teams or teams that use Scrum or Six Sigma. And then you have the people that are just concerned with results and are a little bit more open to something different. Where I wouldn't invest the time initially are the personas where they're just focused on, well, this is how things are or were, and I'm going, you just know who isn't going to change, right? But the key is you use these others and the success that you see in those other teams to then proselytize the strategy, and that starts to crack the other personas open, so to speak, to be like, well, nothing breeds success like success, right? If they see other teams are successful, then suddenly they're a little bit more open
Who
to
wants
it.
to go that? And Mike, finally, have you observed any skills or behaviors that would make uh, a sourcer in your team, a recruiter in your team, more likely to be successful in this type of role than other roles in recruiting? Are there unique attributes that make somebody work well in the proactive environment?
Yeah, I think someone that is comfortable with data. They don't have to be a data guru, but they have to be comfortable with working with numbers and information. Um, they have to want to drive results and improve. So that's critical because every year we try to get better. And then I think the other thing is just really mission driven for my team. That's the thing that gets us through some of the tougher days is knowing that there's patients counting on us to get product to them. And then I would also say someone that is very comfortable having tough conversations regardless of the level of the person on the other side of the table. So I've always told my recruiters and now my sourcers, I don't care what the person's title is. If you got to say something, you got to say it. And 99% of the time, they will respect you more for putting it out there than just kind of going along with what they're saying. Because TA's done a great job of educating the business about how tough it is to fill jobs, but we haven't done a great job of educating the business around it's tough to fill jobs and here's what you need to do differently. And I think the business is really craving that level of leadership from talent acquisition, sourcing, whatever the department is, whatever name it is, to lead them through these challenges. Because if we defer to them, they're going to keep going back to time to fill, quality of hire, cost per hire. They're going to go back to the same things they always have because they just don't know any better. And and why would we expect them to know any better? That's not their expertise. This is our expertise. So it's up to us to educate them and lead them through it. And that's why it's critical that my team have this comfort with talking to a VP or a senior VP when they're, a mid-level professional and helping them through this change of mindset, so to speak.
So that's arguably the hardest skill to find and develop. And
Mm-hmm.
I think there is a cohort of folks in the recruiting community you might see sourcing when they see that group or title as being the subordinates of a recruiter. But the way you framed it and the way you set it up, Mike, the best folks with the best advisory skills, consultative skills, are the ones you put into that team.
Mm-hmm.
Reactionary is probably an easier job or different job.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Not
Yeah.
let's not call it easier, but it's certainly not a lesser job to be the sourcer. Far from that. That skill
Oh,
set.
no. Yeah.
We were in a group with a group of recruiters in Louisville last week with the Career Crossroads group, and we had one of the panelists say that she takes on new recruiters and she would go through a series of questions with them, and she would say, I'm paraphrasing, she'd say something like, "So, Mike, can you run a marathon in an hour?" And you'll say, "No." "Okay. Can you jump over a wall?" "No." "Can you do X? Can you do Y?" Like, "No." She goes, "Brilliant. I just wanted to see if you could say no, because I don't see you doing it in your job." And she highlighted this kind of issue of we tend to please as a kind of sector or function. And that's not necessarily what the business sometimes needs. You need to push back. You need to have difficult conversations with senior people and not be intimidated by their, as you say, title, because you're
Yes.
just trying to get a solution for them. And sometimes no is the answer, but maybe it's a no, and here's a
Yeah.
different way. Or we can try something else, and not just being negative, but being consultative. Mike, it's been wonderful to hear the story. I think what you've set up is phenomenal. It's kind of been the holy grail for a lot of teams. A lot of teams have tried and failed. You seem to have clicked on a magic formula. Whether it's comes from your aviation roots, maybe more folks need to go from aviation into recruiting, and they can have such success. But Mike, if another leader listening to this podcast or watching today would love to know more, pick your brain about it, what's the best way to reach out to you?
Oh, more than happy to meet with anyone, talk them through the strategy. I do it from time to time for other companies. Reach out via LinkedIn. You can email me directly, direct message me, whatever way is available to you. I have a fairly broad network, but always open to growing it more.
Mike, it's been a pleasure, and thanks for sharing so generously of the story. I think it's wonderful what you've done with the team. I think it's something that we can all learn from, and I'm looking forward to hear what's next with the team.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a pleasure being on the podcast with you. And anytime I can help with anything else, feel free to let me know.
Thanks, Mike. And a big thank you to you for joining us this week. Hopefully that's been super insightful. You're probably scribbling notes and wondering how you can pick Mike's brain. He's on the West Coast, but as you said, he works internationally and open to help anybody who wants to reach out with a similar challenge. We're going to be back next week with another great guest on the Hiring Excellence podcast, solving the problems that you hopefully want to hear of most. And if you're interested in coming onto the podcast, do reach out to the team. You can reach me, Johnny, at socialtalent.com. Until next week, take care.